This is a Frontline Club event recorded on the 21st of May 2020. A discussion with Lina Sinjab, Mikhail Fishman, and Bill Frelick.
I wonder if I might start with Bill and ask you to lay out the stall. Why has COVID made this period, not necessarily today, but all these days, really days to bury bad news?
Well, it's particularly bad news for refugees and migrants, asylum seekers, which are the group of human rights victims that I concentrate on within Human Rights Watch. And I think in many respects, the virus becomes a pretext for the intent of many governments to close their borders, to block asylum seekers from being able to lodge claims for protection, for preventing people from being able to seek asylum, to seek protection. And the close down, of course, has been particularly bad for refugees who are already in many cases scapegoated and vilified and segregated, and many times in closed and overcrowded camps and other encampments where conditions are poor to begin with, and healthcare is little and far between. And so very basic questions like social distancing, running water, soap are not available in many cases to refugees, and yet they're forced into these confined spaces and scapegoated even when they don't actually carry disease. And we've seen this in place after place here in the United States, in Greece, in Africa, where the pretext of now, if it's not vilifying refugees and asylum seekers as a few years ago being terrorists in disguise, now they're disease carriers, even without evidence showing that. And what we've been trying to argue with governments is that there's nothing incompatible between taking reasonable measures for public health and isolating people according to public health needs and standards, while at the same time providing protection to those people who need it.
Thank you very much. Lina, what can you tell us about bad news buried in the Arab world?
Well, Liz, bad news has marked the Arab world. This is a region that is marked with turmoil and troubles, with wars, this instability, poverty, corruption, and dictatorship. So COVID or Corona came to top all of that and make it even worse for people. This is certainly here in Lebanon, where I continue covering this story, but also in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt. The region here, there is one issue that is common among people, is that people don't trust their governments, and therefore all the numbers and figures that are coming out about the corona are still questionable to a large scale. In Lebanon, the government has done a good job in following and tracing and including introducing measures to fight the disease, but this is a country of 4 million people, added almost 1.5 million refugees that is already struggling with its economy. People took to the streets in October last year in thousands across the country, from all sects, all classes, because they are fed up with a corrupt government. But what we are seeing today is even more deteriorating economic situation. The value of the Lebanese lira has devaluated by almost 150%. The prices have gone up tremendously. And remember, Liz, not only in Lebanon, but across the region, this is a region where people, the majority of the population, rely on day-to-day jobs. So lockdown even made it even worse to people to earn their living. That's why it forced people, certainly in Lebanon, where they still enjoy political freedoms, freedom of expression. They took to the streets again, protesting against the government, not caring about the corona. People, you hear them talking, saying, the economy, starvation, poverty is worse for us than the corona. This is certainly the case in Syria and also in Egypt, but it's really underreported because of the oppression that the government uses against its own people. We've seen in Egypt a trend of even arresting more and more civil society activists, freedom of expression activists. Even 2 days ago, like a prominent journalist, was arrested for a few days and then released only because she went to report on a story of the locked in, the imprisoned, civil society activists. So bad news is not new to this region, and Corona just only made it worse. Now the countries are opening up gradually, but the question of economy and the threat of the disease are still pressing on people's lives.
Thank you very much. Misha, what's the view from Moscow? President Putin was slow to declare a lockdown, and now he seems to be jumping the gun and removing it again. What's driving him?
Yes, well, much of what Lina just said applies to Russia to various degrees, mostly to, of course, to Southern Republic of Dagestan, where the pandemic has gone out of control. The only Russian region where it clearly has gone out of control. And this week, the government and Vladimir Putin actually have admitted it finally. But to get back to what you were asking, yes, the problem with the Russian political landscape is that rather than the pretext for tightening control measures or for manipulations or whatever it might be, the pandemic has become an obstacle for Vladimir Putin and his political agenda. He had to postpone very important events that he had scheduled for this spring, earlier this year, before the pandemic started. I'm talking about the end of the war parade of May 9th, where dozens heads of governments were expected, and it was seen as a moment of triumph for Vladimir Putin and his agenda. But mostly, and more importantly, his amendments to Russian Constitution, which various amendments, but the most important one would allow him to run for president for two more terms, and after 2024, when his current presidential term ends. The popular vote that he introduced and was scheduled for April 22 was postponed indefinitely. And Vladimir Putin found himself in a position when every new day of the lockdown came at a huge cost, because Russia entered two crises simultaneously. The one, the virus itself, and the second is, of course, economy. The oil price has dropped, just plunged, and Russia entered just in 1 second, entered the heaviest economic crisis it ever had under Putin for last 20 years. So the Kremlin and the government clearly understood that, and they had to postpone everything they postponed, but they had also to come back because the Kremlin understands that Vladimir Putin's approval rating have dropped. We don't know exact numbers. We don't know if we can trust the pollsters close to the Kremlin. Apparently we can't. But we do know that they operate with numbers which show significant drop of not only personal Vladimir Putin's rating, but also the failure of his political agenda. Like everything that he was going to is now failing. The narrative that he was building. So he wants to get back as soon as possible. That's why he announced last week, yes, the end of national lockdown, though the governors in the regions are still can prolong their local lockdowns, which is also happening, and he goes for this national popular vote for June 24, but this date is not officially set yet because Vladimir Putin has not yet signed the decree, because he knows that the cost of one more postponement of the vote would be very, very high indeed. And now with the developments in Dagestan, and there are rumors that Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov has been diagnosed with COVID yesterday or today, recently, and so probably it's not only about Dagestan, but the pandemic has not gone yet. So the Kremlin is probably not sure that they can still run the vote in 1 month. So this is sort of the situation they're stuck in right now, and this is the situation that that defines the political moment right now.
How? Let me come back to you, Bill. How have the media been complicit in allowing coronavirus to dominate the news to the extent that a lot of other stories, and certainly the plight of refugees around the world, is just pushed completely off the radar?
It is the headline news, and it is the preoccupation of everyone. And I think it actually does create some distortions where those of us that are advocates, in order to remind people that the plight of refugees and asylum seekers is getting even worse, to show the links to COVID in order to make it relevant and part of the discussion, and to get the coverage that we need in order to be able to talk about these issues. Well, I think one of the difficulties is that everyone gets into a defensive crouch here, and the instinct, of course, is to separate yourself and to be fearful of the other, who you think may be carrying disease, and that I think is particularly harmful for marginalized communities, whatever they may be, but particularly migrants. The word migration itself, for people who move, and so the stigma that has attached to migrants and refugees in the popular mentality, and the populist politicians like Orban in Hungary, or Trump in the United States, is to play on those fears and to use that politically in order to bolster political support, and it really makes it very difficult, I think, to try to have a rational discussion about real public health needs and how those public health needs can be addressed in a rational way that doesn't throw out civil liberties, that doesn't throw out human rights, that doesn't treat people as though they're not actually human.
I have a question here from Robert Wallace, and I think I'll toss this to you, Lena. Could somebody speak to the annexation of the West Bank later this year by the Netanyahu government, and how the extent to which it's gone pretty much unmorted in the current COVID crisis?
Sorry, I've missed part of your question, Elizabeth.
Okay, let me repeat it then. Robert Wallace writes a question to you. How has the possible annexation of the West Bank by this new Israeli government headed by Benjamin Netanyahu gone completely uncovered, whereas in a non-COVID world, it would have been headline news everywhere?
Yeah, Liz, I mean, this is, the whole story of Palestine have dropped from the main news agenda in the past, few years. There's the Arab Spring, there is the war in Syria, the war in Yemen that made it slip away from the headline of the news for many years. So let alone that today with the COVID-19 issue that is totally dominating all the news agenda, you know, not only the headline, every news bulletin is on COVID-19. Every item in the news is on COVID. So that really slipped on the news agenda. And let alone as well that the Arab world themselves, the Arab leaders have just left Palestine and the Palestinian issue behind their back. I mean, let's see the position of Saudi Arabia from the Palestinian case. See the position of Saudi Arabia from declaring Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That was also big news for the Arab world that, was not, highlighted at all by the leaders of the Arab world, who were the leaders of the Muslim community who should defend the Palestinians and the Palestinian rights. So it's not surprised at all that such big news for the Palestinians and for the Arab world who are concerned about this situation that goes missing from the news agenda today. I mean, there is a big responsibility on the newsmakers, on the editors of trying to balance the news agenda, but often the case is that the politics and what happens outside enforces our news agenda. So that's, a sad situation, but it's the real situation.
Misha, I'm struck by how the situation in Russia is almost a negative image, in the sense that if coronavirus is the bad news, and it certainly is, President Putin seems to be maneuvering to bear that bad news in order to get his political agenda, to further his political agenda. Is it going to work? I mean, can you really minimize the effects of an epidemic on a people? Go ahead with a referendum.
Well, if I would know the answer to your question, this is very, very hard to tell. But you cannot, in a way, you can say that the government uses these two crises, to the economic crisis and the pandemic, as a pretext to adjust the legislation to their own needs. But again, they wouldn't probably do it if not the pandemic and the crisis. And what I'm talking about is that during last 2 weeks they have again very quickly approved new legislation on voting. I can quickly tell you what it is. It's they have reduced significantly the barrier for false signatures. If you're running, if
Is that Misha's audio frozen or mine? Lena, can you hear Misha?
I can hear you and I can see you fine, yeah.
But not Misha. Can you hear Misha?
No,
okay.
He's frozen.
It's frozen.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure he'll sort it out. Bill, let me ask you, where is the most egregious burial of news of the plight of refugees at the moment? What areas are you aware of?
Well, well, there are so many protracted refugee situations in far-flung places that never reach the Tinduf camp in Algeria, or you have between 200 and 250,000 refugees still in the Dadaab camps from the early 90s in Kenya, from Somalia, where COVID was just reported, confirmed cases yesterday. I think Greece, the situation there is relatively better known because it is in Europe. The United States is diverting and deflecting asylum seekers to Mexico, to Central America. I don't know how much awareness there is in Europe and the rest of the world about that, if it gets lost in the news shuffle there. And again, many of these are pretexts for policies that these governments have wanted to promote all along. And I'll give us an example of that. Bangladesh, which has been wanting since the huge influx of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar in late 2017, they've been wanting to move a very large number of those refugees to an uninhabited island that's been created by silt in the Indian Ocean. It's called Basan Char. And we and other advocates have been resisting this all along. It would isolate these people, segregate them. It's an island that's subjected to being inundated in high tides, and the advocacy on behalf of refugees has deterred the Bangladeshi government from moving people to this island until now. But under the cover of COVID, they've moved 300 refugees to this island, and now we're just getting the reports of the Amphan cyclone, and reports of evacuating up to millions of people from coastal areas of Bangladesh and India, and yet you've just put these refugees onto this island, and this is just the toe in the door, so to speak, of trying to move thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of refugees onto this island. And so, this is the sort of thing that I think it's being done on the pretext that this is a health measure. This is a quarantine measure. We're quarantining people here. Similarly, Greece, it closed its asylum system in the beginning of March after President Erdogan of Turkey had announced the opening of the border. It had nothing to do with COVID-19 whatsoever. But at the point at which the suspension of the asylum procedures was supposed to open up again, COVID-19 then became the pretext for continuing the suspension of asylum. And what we're seeing in the case of Greece, and I think this is quite underreported, is that they are pushing back not just people at the border, which they've been doing for some time, but they're actually now, in just the last few weeks, taking people from much further in who have been in Greece for some time and completely extrajudicially, summarily pushing people back, but it's not even a pushback. It's really a deportation without going through proper procedures at a time where there's into Turkey in the dead of night. So they're taking them to the Turkish border, and they're waiting until the Turkish border guards are not around, finding places where they can push them back. These are not crossing points. These are not official readmissions. These are completely extra legal, and we have been documenting this. We're in the process of documenting it now, but it's been documented by some news sources and some NGOs. But it's very difficult for us to do the research now because we ourselves are very limited in our ability to travel. I was just in Greece in March up until the point, I had to leave basically, get the last plane out, so to speak. And we had researchers that were on the Turkish side of that same border while I was on the Greek side. And we're all trying to do this research remotely. So the challenges for us as human rights investigators is actually very great as well, because we are the ones that need to tell these hidden stories. And it's getting increasingly difficult for us to do that.
Thank you very much. I see Misha's back. Welcome back, Misha. Yeah. Let's see if we can pick up your thought there. You were yes. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. So they tightened the legislation which describes the voting process, and so the first thing they did, they lowered this bar of false. Supposedly false signatures that you have to collect if you're running as an independent candidate, which allows you to easier ban everyone who's running on his own. So to ban every independent candidate twice as easier as it has been before. And if you probably remember that the crisis last summer with the election in Moscow, it started with about these signatures, which were all described as false by the electoral committees. And the second thing is that they now if you're an activist but you are sentenced to a medium degree crime, you cannot run as well. You will have you will be banned, which again allows to take out of the election every significant political activist, because you always can charge him with something which will make this process much easier. And third thing, most importantly, they significantly change the voting process itself. So now for any election, you have now various methods of how to vote. You can vote by mail, you can vote electronically, you can vote somewhere, not at the special stations, but just somewhere in the city, whatever it is. You can vote by mail, various ways of voting, and the idea is very clear. It's to take it out of outside control. So the more ways of voting you have, the easier it is to manipulate the vote. I'm telling this as an answer to your question because they clearly understand the situation is changing gradually, very, very fast. And with previous rules of the game, they wouldn't be able to win the election, even in this landscape where there is every alternative to the authorities has been diminished to not seeable size. So that's what they clearly understand, that the situation is changing and adopting the rules to this new picture.
And they've been able to do it under the cover of COVID. Like,
well, no,
people have been afraid or diverted by COVID. They've moved to do all this.
They do not refer to COVID. They just changed the rules of the game. There is no connection between, clear, obvious connection for the voter between why you can't run, why you have, if on these conditions now, and the COVID. It just doesn't make any sense. It probably, the voting by mail, which they introduced last week, can be referred to COVID. Of course, they do not mention it, but it's clear that in the regions like in, we don't know, probably Dagestan, probably others, which will not be able to ease their lockdowns, local lockdowns, by the moment that they will still have their the vote. And do not forget that we have quite important regional elections later this September. So it's will allow regional authorities to run the election the way they want, better, again, in order to get the better and the only possible outcome.
Bill raised an interesting point, and that is that all journalists and activists are now prevented from traveling, at least traveling as freely as we wished to and certainly would like to. Lena, what stories have you not been able to get to that you would like to, or where you think it would be important to be a witness because of the coronavirus?
Yeah, Liz, also again, in this part of the world, like Syria is a great example, which was hard to get to the news by moving or traveling because of the government's control of the situation. But of course, as journalists, it's always best to be in the place, to see people face to face, to hear their voices, to understand their emotions, to be able to report on the story. And that's something like it's almost impossible to do these days. And not only here in Lebanon, even like this is the backdrop of my live position in Beirut, where I'm covering the story just from my desk. I managed to go out to do a couple of stories, but really social distancing and stuff. But of course, I think, seconding Bill's words, the refugee story is the most important story. I would love to be in refugee camp, not only here in Lebanon, but probably, in Idlib, in northern Syria, in different different parts of Syria. Yemen is another story that you really need to be there on the ground to tell it. But that also brings me back to salute to the great and brave citizen journalists who are on the ground, not only in Syria, but across the Arab world, who are using their mobile phone, or even just individual people who are now, because of this lockdown, everyone is reporting their own situation, uploading videos. We've seen videos coming out from Egypt where, you know, they're pleading for the government to help for the coronavirus. We've seen videos from loyalists to Assad's regime going into the areas of the isolation, you know, drastic conditions that are there, and just like questioning the government, what are you doing to do on this story? So I think also the concept of journalism not only changed during the Arab Spring and the emergence of the civil citizen journalists and the mobile phones and Facebook, but COVID-19 also changed our concept and understanding and tools of reporting the story. It's always great to be, from a human perspective and professional one, to be on the ground with people, but we all have to adapt and accept the new methods that are coming up. Of course, we have the big question of verification, of making sure that the news is coming. That's the job that we are trained to do, and we develop it by our own conscience throughout our own context. And I think, and you know this also, Liz, you've been to Syria before, that we always had to have check 1, 2, 3 times on the story before we broadcast it and talk to people about it. And that's what we continue to do today.
Thank you. Bill, I've got a question here for you from Lynn's Mac. And that is, what are you seeing about the plight of asylum seekers and or immigrants who have arrived in a country of asylum but have a very fragile position? Has the whole reaction to COVID, and particularly the sucking up of public services to deal with this epidemic, just made their lives even harder?
Yes, I mean the simple and clear answer to that is that these are marginalized communities in the first place. I'm tempted to talk about Lebanon with Lena, here as well, but you have a case there where at this point something around 80% of the Syrian refugees no longer have legal residency in the country, and so they're in a very precarious position legally. And then economically, of course, the country, as Lena has said, is devastated economically. And so you can only imagine the situation where with much of the dysfunctionality of the central government in Lebanon, you have municipalities that are creating curfews and other restrictions that are in a very discriminatory way targeted to the refugee population. And I include Palestinians in that as well as Syrians. And so, without any evidence base, simply because these are othered, because they can be scapegoated and are used in some ways to bolster existing prejudices. And we see that it's playing out in South Africa. We Human Rights Watch just did a press release today on confinement of refugees and immigrants in South Africa, and the impact on not that this is a group that's not being able to get the food aid that's going to everyone else, and why is that? And similarly, the ongoing problems here in the United States with the long-standing immigrant populations here that ironically are in many respects considered the essential workers who are disproportionately involved in healthcare, involved in agriculture, involved in all the elements of society that are working hard to counteract the COVID-19 virus, and yet they're not the steps needed to regularize their status and to have the same doctors and medical staff of Asian descent, after saving lives, going out on the street and encountering racist xenophobia because our government, among others, has vilified Chinese and Chinese Americans. Again, as part of a manipulation of fears and prejudices in order to make political gain.
Here's a question that asks you to hand out compliments or kudos. Is there a country or countries that are doing exceptionally well in protecting their immigrants or refugees in spite of the public health emergency?
I think Portugal gets high marks. Portugal announced early on that it would, during this crisis, treat immigrants and people with pending asylum claims as though they were permanent residents, to ensure that they would get all the social services that they need. And Italy, actually, although I think there are more significant problems with xenophobia there and other issues, particularly involving Mediterranean boat interdictions and this sort of thing. But on that scale, in terms of access to social services, it has also taken steps to try to mitigate the harmful effects of the COVID-19 on the immigrant communities there.
Karen Merkel writes, Al Jazeera reports today that 20 journalists have been arrested in Bangladesh, and she wants to know whether any of you are seeing an upsurge in attacks or arrests or harassment of journalists and a curtailing of media freedom during the pandemic. Misha, are you seeing anything like that in Russia?
Yes, I think I do. Again, just when the whole thing started, I think it was early April, they introduced a special, again, new legislation which allows for law enforcement to suppress misinformation on COVID, so-called. It's what the whole thing was about, and that's what they actually do. They hunt for those who question the official. Like, for example, this huge discussion, which is now a global discussion, it's not only in Russia, about the death toll in Russia, which is ways less than everywhere comparably. And these numbers are very controversial in itself and in their nature. And already one media outlet has received a so-called notice from a government watchdog, and the second one would lead to what? They would ban the website. They would go further. So I have to be very cautious when I'm talking about these numbers, and when I join this discussion, because also Dost, the TV Rain, the network where I have my show, can also be hit with these measures. It also applies to individuals who the law enforcement hunts for. I think dozens already have been charged with spreading misinformation, like yes, dozens have been charged, and it can be everything. Like, I don't know, like telling that that masks sent over from China as humanitarian aid had been put on sale. The woman was charged with misinformation just today. I don't know. We don't know what will come out of it, but the trend is obvious.
Well, it's tempting to think it might even get worse. If President Putin needs this pandemic to disappear in order for him to get on with his referendum, you might see the repression increase. Absolutely.
Yes. If something like in Dagestan happens, if not only something like in Dagestan happens, because if they feel that they have the situation under control, with numbers of infected and even dead underreported, for example, as it is probably most likely the case for whole Russia, as for Moscow, which has been hit the most, and for the regions. But like in Moscow, the situation is considered under control. It's probably worse than the average audience thinks it is, but it's under control. But disasters like in Dagestan, they put under question the whole agenda, because you can't hide a nightmare like in Dagestan. You have to act. You have to, and it affects the whole the whole line of political decisions afterwards.
Is Dagestan a big story?
It's getting bigger and bigger. It's now, Dagestan is probably not, is now under sort of direct federal control. They tried to suppress the pandemic there with federal forces. They didn't send the army yet, but we can imagine it.
Wow. Yeah. Lena, what's happening in the Arab world? Are journalists who are trying to report on COVID that governments wish to keep dark, are they being harassed and arrested?
Liz, I've missed part of your question because your picture was frozen, but I guess you're asking about the situation of journalists in the Arab world.
Correct.
And of course, Liz, this hasn't been a great case for journalists at any time in the Arab world. You know, Lebanon may be an exception because there is a great deal of freedom of expression. Of course, the government here finds different ways of manipulating a situation with journalists. So, for example, this week, a couple of journalists were summoned. The government, they had attended to court with allegations that they are weakening the government's position simply because they have provoked or uncovered, you know, corruption deals, especially about for example, the governor of the central bank. But Egypt is a very bad situation. Lina Atallah, the editor of Al-Mada News, she's a great journalist. She's well-known, award-winning journalist, has been arrested 2 days ago simply because she went to the prison's door to talk to one of the prisoners' mothers who went on a hunger strike and wanted to spend her time outside the prison waiting for her son to come out. And there are endless stories like this. I mean, it's hard to hear about journalists today being arrested in Assad's Syria because, you know, the ones who are able to operate in government-controlled areas, they operate within the, you know, the red lines and the codes that the government would allow them to talk about that. I mean, I remember talking to people at the beginning of the COVID-19 in Syria, just ordinary people on the phone, on WhatsApp, that people think it is secure. And people, I know that their reasoning is you know, is reasonable and, you know, justified, and they would never ever want to talk about COVID-19. They say, we have no cases here in Syria. There is nothing like that here in Syria. People have some chest infections, but not COVID. So people are terrified to talk about it. These are governments that have used fear to control. So it applies to journalists as much as it applies to ordinary people. Of course, the journalists are more exposed, but, you know, sadly, in many countries, Syria is an example. You know, the journalists who are able to write are only writing and working within government-controlled lines.
Mm-hmm. I'm just I'm watching a little news feed here as we go, and apparently Beijing's proposing some new draconian laws for Hong Kong, and it reminded me of all the Hong Kong democracy activists suddenly having been arrested while the rest of the world was preoccupied with COVID and COVID. Martin Nangle, who is a photojournalist and the chairman of the Associated Photojournalism for Arts and Culture, he asks rather provocatively, I think, how much the media itself is complicit in turning a massive searchlight, if you like, on COVID and all the stories associated with it, and willfully ignoring the more complex stories that they kind of know in their hearts people are not that interested in right now. Bill?
Well, I mean, it's the same struggle that we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes. What sells newspapers, and what do your editors want you to do? And when you're sitting at home, what's the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, of the story that you're going to do? Because getting into, to talk about protracted refugee situations, the Dadaab camp or one of these other long-standing the camps on the Thai Myanmar border that have been there since the mid 1980s. And these are long-standing stories. Before COVID-19, it was really, really difficult to get anyone to care or to pay attention to them. And now there's so many ripple effects, if you will, that are not COVID-19 direct impact on refugees and other marginalized communities. But look at the drying up of remittances around the world. I mean, you look at a population like Haiti. I mean, this is a population that depends on remittances from abroad. And when Haitians in the diaspora are no longer able to work, they're not sending money home. And there are people that are in the brink of starvation because they don't have foreign aid coming to them. And foreign aid, in many respects, has been predicated on the knowledge that much of the real foreign aid coming into the country was in the form of remittances. And so these kinds of economic impacts are the sorts of things that I think are really completely off the scale in terms of anything that people are looking at. I mentioned the cyclone. I mean, we have this issue of climate change that suddenly is, even more difficult to raise, and yet there's right as we speak, there's one of the most enormous locust infestations occurring in the Horn of Africa right now that is of biblical proportions. And locust swarms and swarms of millions of locusts that are just eating up any of the harvest of food that in months from now, when you put that together with COVID and there's, I mean, I don't know how many people listening to this broadcast are even aware of this food insecurity in the Horn of Africa that in a matter of months could mean famine on top of disease. And so you have communities that are really in precarious situations, places like Somalia that have failed states and have conflict and endemic health and other problems that are now faced with food insecurity that they haven't seen in perhaps decades, on top of disease. And this is really enormously underreported. And so I think that the complexity of understanding the cumulative effect of these economic factors, environmental factors, pandemic, on communities that are not just underreported. I mean, when we're reporting cases of COVID itself, that presupposes testing and some transparency. And so what do we really know about COVID in sub-Saharan Africa, where the capacity to test simply isn't there in many cases? And so we don't even know what we're talking about in terms of the disease itself, but we're seeing other humanitarian impacts in terms of drought, in terms of things like locust infestations, rising sea levels, that when you put these factors together, we're looking at some potentially, the catastrophic situation that we're looking at is actually, I hate to say it, but it's a lot worse than what we're looking at the moment here in the United States, with the highest number of reported COVID cases and a death rate that's over 82,000 at this point.
Well, it sounds as if the fallout from this could result in enormous stories, and the ability of journalists to cover them is still uncertain, or when we can get back to it. Certainly right now, it's so curtailed and frustratingly so, and I speak as a field journalist myself. Given that there aren't a lot of field reporters out there, one of our listeners is asking, what is the source of news for you that you trust then at the moment? Who do you look for facts and good analysis? Misha, let me start with you.
Well, More or less as usual. As you probably all know, the media industry in Russia has been largely destroyed in recent years. So you can't rely on national television for obvious reasons. The major newspapers. Well, you just have to learn how to read them because they can be sources of information, but you have to sort of filter them through your own specifically built-in filters that you know how to apply to various sources of information. That's how authoritarian regime information landscape basically works, and so it's basically the same thing now. And we also rely on, and me personally, on insights that I might have from my sources, and at least they're sort of their assessments of what is going on and what is the situation right now, and the reasoning why government acts in such way and not in the other. Basically, it's been the same for many years already.
Lena, how about you? Where do you turn to for facts and solid analysis?
You know, Liz, I think we as professionals, we've always had our networks of checking and talking to people and having your trusted contacts and, comparing the news from between different sources before you go out and broadcast it. I mean, I personally, as an Arab journalist, I can read in English and also in Arabic. I can tell you that the Arab media is like falling down completely. Its eclipse started with the uprising in the Arab world, with the polarization with the Arab states, and then it became even worse with the split between inside the Gulf, Saudi Arabia versus Qatar, Saudi Arabia funded news versus Qatari funded news. So I think even the locals in the Arab world, they have their own suspicion about the media and the news. Everyone is like very cynical. But I guess, it's not only during the COVID time, but since the, social media has dominated our lives and changed our way of dealing with the media, I think the challenge is there. The challenge is that we know that we need to check the news. We know that there are sources that we need to verify. We know that there are links that are reliable. We read them. But everyone you talk to in the street, they give you false information or misunderstanding or misinterpretation of the situation. And you ask them, where do you get your news from? And they say, Facebook. That goes in the family, in the street, but that dominates people's lives. Everyone has a mobile phone these days, the 14 years old and the 80 years old, and everyone is reading their news, taking the news from their news feed, not from BBC or Al Jazeera, or there is a news feed that they have that is filling their mind and making them make their own decisions. And in a region that is really filled with conspiracy theory, even COVID-19 had its own, different interpretation of conspiracy theory. Some people, consider that is like China made because they want to invade us, and the others said that no, it's America made because they want to, destroy China, and the list. So I think this is a challenge that has been ongoing since social media started to dominate our lives, and will continue to be a challenge, especially for us professionals, to keep people interested in listening to the news and getting the news from the right sources.
Yeah. Bill, how about you? Where do you turn for facts and analysis?
Well, I completely agree with everything that Lena just said. We are consumers of news and information, as well as fact finders ourselves and producers of that news. And so for us, verification, corroboration, triangulating information, this is something that we speak the same language as journalists in this regard. I mean, our entire credibility as a human rights organization is absolutely dependent on the accuracy and the objectivity of our research, of the reporting itself. We do advocacy, yes, but the advocacy has to be built on a foundation of empirical evidence that we hope is irrefutable, that is factual and We are fact finders, and we take facts very, very seriously. And in working with our sources, if it's not a primary source, if we're not doing the interview ourselves, or finding the information ourselves, and working with media accounts, we're subjecting, as we're reading and as we're consuming, if you will, that information, we are engaged in a process that Misha talked about, a verification, in terms of what you know, and what points of reference you can make to try to triangulate points of information to basically understand factually what you're saying, and then recognize that we're going to have different interpretations of those facts, and we will bring different values to bear and different priorities in terms of, is human rights more important to you than your sovereign power, if you will? And we recognize that different interlocutors will have different views on those things. But if we can agree on the fact basis, that to me is essential. And this is something that in the last several years in particular has eroded, and confidence in facts and the notion of fake news is something that has been very corrosive and made, I think, it very difficult to do a kind of advocacy that basically says, look, I can respect you, you can respect me, let's understand what our differences are, but agree on facts, agree on certain let's call them the etiquette of debate and of airing of differences of opinion, but let's distinguish between opinion and fact, and do that in a civil sort of way that we can move forward. And I really, it's disheartening for me, because as an advocate in Washington, D.C., I feel that the ground, which has been a fairly firm ground on which we've stood for my entire career, just in the last several years, that ground has really shifted in ways that are very disturbing. And the nature of debate on political questions, if you will, speaking broadly, like human rights, is really one that we've lost the confidence in facts, and we have to recover that. I think it's essential.
Yeah, I think, Lena, in the Arab world, where facts have been disputed for so long, and in fact there were among the authoritarian regimes of the Arab world, like, real efforts to completely squelch facts. COVID must be easier for people to assume that COVID is another one of those swirling, rumor-based, impossible to confirm or deny things. In other words, people are more inclined to look to social media and believe in the rumors, as opposed to try and really nail down what the truth is.
Yes, Liz. I mean, it's really hard to nail down what the truth is. I mean, I have to say, here in Lebanon, the government has done a really good job. They have daily report that comes out of the Ministry of Health. They have like the testing mechanism that is ongoing. They've imposed restrictions, introduced different phases of easing on movement. But that's the official line of the story. There is another side of the story which is hard to verify, is what are the number of cases that are coming out in Hezbollah-controlled areas in the south. The first cases that came into Lebanon, they came from Iran. We were all covering the story. I was covering the story from here about cases in Tehran, while the flights were still ongoing back and forth to Syria and to Lebanon from Tehran, and to Iraq as well. And just like later, like probably early March, where the flights have stopped, and the situation was already drastic in Iran. So imagine how many cases are here in Lebanon. The Hezbollah portrayed a big show of their readiness, their medical teams that are prepared, their ambulances. And the way, the scale of their readiness and makeshift hospitals that we prepared makes you raise a question about how many cases are actually there in the south. Of course, this is an area that hasn't been verified. It's hard to talk about it, but it raises a question, especially for curious journalists who want to know. But it's hard to verify it.
Yeah.
But in other places, Egypt and Syria are example. Even Egypt, even Iraq. The Reuters have gone. The government complained about the Reuters report that says the real figures are higher, much higher than what the government is saying. In Syria, it's a no-go area. Nobody is talking about it. Egypt is the same. I mean, I was talking to some people in Egypt the other day, and they just mentioned, they've passed away. They don't even mention the word that they passed because of coronas. People are too scared of talking about it. And the government propaganda machine keeps airing on national televisions and pro-government televisions that everything is under control, that the situation is totally right. So people turn to their own connections and turn to social media to get the news and know what's happening. But what's the problem, Liz, is even though if people knew about the danger of corona, knew about that the cases that are there are not reported properly, that their government is not going to provide enough medical support, they're hungry. Their drive to survive gets them out of their house, and they need to work and they need to feed themselves and feed their families if they manage to do so. And the lockdown had done really terrible for all those people who are on the poverty line or even below the poverty line. Around the world, in the US, in the UK, people were paid compensation for staying at home. Employers were told to pay full salaries for the employees. But as I said at the beginning of this session, the majority, more than 60% in all these countries in this region, people depend on daily jobs, on very, very low wages, and that has gone. That is lost. And in Lebanon, I go back to Lebanon, the situation is even worse because the economy is in total collapse.
Yeah. The reverberations of this are going to be massive down through the coming years. I think we can all see that, although it's hard to see exactly how it's going to play out. Here's a $1 million question to you, Misha, from Isabel Curley. Are we watching the beginning of the end of Putin here? I'm not hearing you.
It's muted.
Misha, you're muted. There we go. Yeah.
Yes. I'm sorry, the connection seems to be unstable, and I'm dropping out of the conversation once in a while. But to try to answer this question, I think this is a major hit for personally to Putin and his regime. It doesn't mean that it will collapse soon or in like very near perspective, but it looks like it's the start of its end. If before the crisis Putin was heading for his re-election in 2024, now it's would be probably we could assume that he could consider not running.
Rather than lose.
Yes, because now the whole idea of stability that he was building for 20 years has collapsed. And the whole narrative that he was relying so much when he was promoting his constitutional amendments, the so-called new Putin's constitution, let's say, the narrative that Russia is getting better and better and stronger and greater, not only in its military, on a military scale, but also as a well, of course, he couldn't go that far as to say that we're getting richer and richer, but at least he could refer to some kind of stability and that it's not like all the Yeltsin times when people were half starving and it was so very unsecure environment. Now the country is secure, the regime is secure, lives are secure, and this is how we go forward to our new. And this is why the Russia needs him personally for near future. All this narrative has collapsed. He could still stay and rely on his law enforcement, and this is apparently what we're going to see in 2 years to come, on more repression. But this is a turning point.
Wow, that's big news.
Well,
Bill, I'm going to come to you. We're running out of time, and it's too bad because we've got questions coming in. This one is quite specific, and it's to Bill Enhoa Paredes. I hope I'm saying that correctly. That Sky's headline here in the UK this morning was about migrants crossing the channel, more migrants crossing the channel. There's been a steady stream since the pandemic began, and indeed before. Do you know who they are, where they're coming from, and what is the situation of the migrants who were congregating on the north side of the channel? They're trying to get to Britain all around Calais. What's going on with them?
Oof, I don't know. I saw that headline, but I have to confess I didn't read the story. So I'm not that familiar with what's happening right now on the channel. We've certainly been looking at the situation in Calais over a number of years, particularly really excessive police force, I would say, has been the main issue there with unaccompanied children for the most part. And I know that one of the initiatives was trying to find a regularized way of reuniting children, and a lot of these are teenage boys, but yes, they are children after all, with family members that are in the UK. And so we recognize that in many cases, the motivation of the migrant slash asylum seeker, again, unaccompanied children oftentimes have this mix where, they don't have fully formed sort of political identities. They're not persecuted in the conventional sense, but they may be abused. They may be treated in ways that need international protection. And so there's special needs and vulnerabilities of unaccompanied children. And things like the Dublin regulation, which have to do with sorting out which EU member state is responsible for examining claims, have exceptions for unaccompanied children. And so this is one of the areas where we've attempted to try to create a situation where people are not, putting themselves into the hands of smugglers or traffickers or taking dangerous journeys, or being subjected to extortion or police abuse. Again, I don't know specifically in terms of what's happening just in the very recent time period, but contextually that gives you some idea of what we've been talking about here. But it is a mix of people, and that's again one of the problems as well, that you have different nationalities that are mixed together in what's called the jungle, which is well named in Calais, because these are makeshift areas, and it involves a variety of people, not all of whom are people that you would want children to be commingled with.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've run out of time. I want to thank you all so much for tackling this topic. The discussion went off in all sorts of fascinating directions, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Bill, Lena, Nisha, thank you very much. Stay well. And I wish good health and great patience to all of the people who've tuned in. And I hope that you'll join us again next week. Many thanks and good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.